2018 Nicaraguan protests response. Domestic. Nicaragua, Vice President and First Lady of Nicaragua Rosario Murillo characterized the protesters as criminals, vampires in search of blood and minuscule and toxic groups. Following his return to public view after being absent for the first 72 hours of protests, President Ortega quickly reversed the Social Security reform and agreed to a Catholic Church-mediated dialogue. Protesters generally were spread across the political spectrum, and Murillo's statements angered the left-wing sector, which responded by destroying her metal trees of life public art pieces in Managua. The majority of those demonstrating do not see any negotiation without the results being Ortega's removal. Domestic NGOs. The NGO Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights, CNI, stated that President Ortega and his wife encouraged and directed the repression against protesters and that the demonstrations are legitimized by a social rejection of the authoritarian way of governing by President Ortega and his wife, Rosario Murillo, and called for dialogue monitored by the United Nations and the Organization of American States. International. Supranational bodies. European Union. On April 20, 2018, the delegation of the European Union in Nicaragua and the heads of mission of the embassies of the member states released a statement lamenting the recent violence, sending condolences to those affected, and calling for dialogue and social peace. On May 31, 2018, the European Parliament condemned the repression used by the Nicaraguan government and called for elections. Organization of American States, Secretary-General Luis Almagro condemned all kinds of violence, calling for peace and stating that citizens have a legitimate right to protest. The OAS voted on July 18, 2018 a resolution condemning the Sandinista regime and asks him to hold elections for 2 years, to March 2019. With 21 votes in favor, 3 against and the same number of absentees and 7 abstentions, the Nicaraguan regime received a harsh attention call. United Nations. Liz Thrussell, spokesperson for the United Nations Human Rights Council, called on the Ortega government to comply with its international obligations to ensure that people can freely exercise their rights to freedom of expression and the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, condemned attacks on journalists, and expressed concern that several television channels that were covering the events have been closed by the government. Following continued repression, the Human Rights Council demanded the Nicaraguan government to allow entry in order to gather first-hand information about the incidents arising from the public demonstrations of April and May. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned the ongoing violence in Nicaragua, particularly the killing of a protester during demonstrations in Managua on Wednesday 30 May. Governments. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, Peru. In a joint statement, the Latin American countries shared concern and regret the acts of violence, making an urgent call for all sides to cease hostilities, particularly that security forces exercise their powers with the utmost prudence to avoid excessive use of force and an escalation of the crisis, allowing the generation of a climate that restores both peace and dialogue, essential to overcome this serious situation. Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned the deepening of repression and the use of lethal and excessive force. The government called for a Nicaraguan ambassador to present herself and provide a statement on the situation. The ministry called for Nicaragua to respect public freedoms and individual rights. Canada. Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland of Global Affairs Canada stated that she was concerned about reports of several deaths and injuries in the demonstrations that are taking place in Nicaragua and called for dialogue. Costa Rica. Minister of Foreign Affairs Christian Guillermet condemned the censorship of media by the Ortega administration. Cuba. The Cuban government defended Ortega, criticizing what it called attempts that aim to destabilize the Republic of Nicaragua, a country that lives in peace and where remarkable social, economic, and security advances have been made in favor of its people. Germany. The Federal Foreign Office called on all factions to immediately renounce the use of force, asked the government of Nicaragua to promptly and fully clarify the cases of fatalities, criticizing the government's use of force and demanded free journalistic coverage, stating that restrictions on press freedom by the government are unacceptable. Mexico. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico called for the cessation of violence and supported the idea of dialogue. Panama. The government of the Republic of Panama spoke in relation to the acts of violence recorded in Nicaragua, before which it makes a firm appeal to those responsible for the armed attacks, arson and crimes, to stop these acts and the most strict respect for life, human rights, security, and peace. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Panama requested that shipments be suspended, by land, of merchandise to Nicaragua while the political conflict in the Central American country is maintained. In a statement, the Foreign Ministry notes that the ambassador of Panama in Nicaragua, Eddie Davis, keeps in touch with the truckers who are stranded in Nicaragua, as a result of which they have not been able to leave that country due to the constant protests and closure of the street that the Nicaraguans maintain against the government of Daniel Ortega. Some have already been released. Panama withdraws the sentence. Violence acts of the last days where journalists, sacerdotes, university students and Nicaraguan citizens have been affected. Spain. The government of Spain demanded the maximum restraint of Nicaragua's security forces and supported dialogue. United States. Ambassador Michael G. Kozak, of the United States Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor stated that Nicaragua is going the wrong direction on many fronts, stating that the Ortega government had a long litany of torture, extrajudicial killing. Kozak criticized censorship, called for the support of NGOs and suggested future targeted sanctions against the Ortega administration, saying that the governments of Cuba and Venezuela are the same camp as Nicaragua. The Trump administration has repeatedly condemned and sanctioned the Ortega government for human rights abuses, especially, but not exclusively, after U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton declared that Nicaragua was part of a troika of tyranny. The most recent sanction was when President Trump signed the NICA Act into law on December 20, 2018. Puerto Rico. Governor of Puerto Rico Ricardo Rossello said, "In Nicaragua there is an attack against human rights by the government of Daniel Ortega." Uruguay. The Ministry of Foreign Relations released a statement supporting calls for reflection and dialogue, denouncing violence and demanding respect for the law and individual rights. Vatican City. Pope Francis expressed concern about the violence in Nicaragua, asking that unnecessary bloodshed be avoided and that open questions be resolved peacefully and with a sense of responsibility. Venezuela. President Nicolás Maduro supported Ortega and Murillo, stating they are facing a violent ambush, describing protesters as violent groups. He also indicated that the government of Daniel Ortega defeated a terrorist and coup plan, saying, "Today, before the imperial aggression, the government of Nicaragua has defeated the terrorist and coup plan. We will win." Maduro wrote on the social network Twitter a day after the Organization of American States, OAS, approved a critical resolution against Sandinista government. In the midst of the political crisis in Nicaragua, which amounts to more than 350 deaths in 3 months of intense protests, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza offered official support to defend the sovereignty of the Central American country. President Daniel Ortega, "If the revolutionaries of Venezuela had to come to Nicaragua to defend Nicaraguan sovereignty and independence, to offer our blood for Nicaragua, we would go like Sandino to the mountain of Nueva Segovia," he said during the commemoration of the 39 years of the Sandinista Revolution, in which the foreign ministers of Venezuela and Cuba were the only representatives of the highest level who accompanied Ortega. Netherlands. The Netherlands cancelled aid for the Nicaraguan government due to severe violations towards the human rights committed by government officials and paramilitary groups. Luxembourg. Luxembourg suspends aid to the Nicaraguan state. NGOs. Amnesty International, Director of the Americas Erica Guevara Rosas condemned brutal attacks against peaceful demonstrators and journalists covering the protest, saying it represents a flagrant and disturbing attempt to restrict their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, while also stating that the government must put an immediate end to all acts of aggression against the public and the press, and conduct an expeditious investigation, impartial and independent, to bring to justice all those responsible for these sinister attacks. São Paulo Forum meeting in Havana. And in the voice of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonçalves said that they should support Venezuela, Brazil, and Nicaragua. The forum expressed its support for the government of Daniel Ortega. Others. Several protests abroad accompanied the development of the demonstrations against INSS reform in Nicaragua. There were protests held in San Jose, Costa Rica, Nicaraguan Embassy, Miami, and Houston consulates, and other cities like Ciudad de Guatemala, Madrid or Barcelona. A group of Nicaraguans residing in Panama demonstrated at the Quinta Costera of Panama's capital. In Spain, there have been at least 8 concentrations of the Nicaraguan community in the country. Of the most active cities in this sense, it is worth highlighting the Andalusian Granada, where hundreds of Nicaraguans and Spanish citizens have concentrated to ask for peace, freedom, and democracy in Nicaragua by reading poems of Nicaraguan writers and a manifesto, demanding that the Ortega Murillo family abandon the power in Nicaragua. There have also been protests in Berlin, Copenhagen, London, Australia, Vienna, Finland, Paris, San Francisco, California, New York, Washington, and Toronto, Canada. Libération, the French newspaper of centre-left or of European left par excellence, in its cover put to Daniel Ortega and his bleeding wife and writes a hard article criticizing the Nicaraguan government and its president. José Mujica, the ex-president of Uruguay and senator for the political party Frente Amplio, joined the criticism of the violence in Nicaragua. Those who were revolutionaries yesterday lost the meaning of life. There are times when you have to say, "I'm leaving," he said in the Senate on Tuesday. The Uruguayan Senate on Tuesday approved a declaration that requires the government of Nicaragua to immediately cease violence against the Nicaraguan people. In addition, he expressed his strong condemnation of all acts of violence and violations of human rights. But these statements did not fall well in some sectors of the Latin American left and generated the reaction of Chávez leader Diosdado Cabello, who criticized him on Thursday in a television audition. "Do not you realize, Pepe, what is happening in Nicaragua at this time? It's the same thing that they did to Venezuela?" said Cabello. Gustavo Petro, in a tweet, former Colombian presidential candidate Gustavo Petro stated that in Venezuela as in Nicaragua there is no socialism. What there is the use of left-wing rhetoric of the 20th century to cover up an oligarchy that steals the state, a minority that governs for itself and violates the rights of the majority. The Colombian senator of the political group List of the Decency, Gustavo Bolívar, published a trill in which he questions Maduro and Ortega, but also criticizes the situation that Colombia is facing in terms of human rights, especially for the murder of social leaders. In 100 days of repression, the Ortega dictatorship killed 305 people. In 125 days of protests, the Maduro dictatorship killed 131 people. In Colombia, without dictatorship, they have killed 342 social leaders, said Bolívar.